Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. As the end of the Czech general elections looms closer, questions remain as to what direction the country might take once the results are in. With populist Andrej Babiš expected to win the popular vote, some worry about Prague experiencing a Hungarian-style about-turn on the European Union and Ukraine policies. But is this inevitable? And is the Czech vote at risk due to Russian interference? Joining us here today is Petr, Director of the Department of Political Science and Anglophone Studies of the Metropolitan University in Prague. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning.
So, of course, the main question everyone is asking is it likely that, given the current polls and given that Andrej Babiš is likely to win this, at least in terms of having the greatest amount of votes, of course, government formation comes later, do you think the policy of the Czech Republic is expected or should be expected to shift radically after that?
Well, the question is going to be how radical it will be. Of course, every political party, every winning coalition brings their own policy. So if Andrej Babiš wins and if he is charged with forming the government, then of course we can expect some changes. The question is how radical, how substantial these changes will be. When you already mentioned the issue of a foreign policy, the issue regarding Ukraine, EU, this will very much depend on who actually will be his coalition partners. Andrej Babiš himself in the past days, in the last days of the election campaign, took some strong rhetorics regarding pro-EU, pro-NATO and anti-Russian, which was a bit surprising because he has never been so strong in these proclamations, given especially who might be his potential coalition partner. And that's going to be the fact or the factor which will decide how sharp the potential change in the Czech foreign policy will be. If Andrej Babiš is, for example, going to make up the government with parties such as SPD, the Freedom and Direct Democracy, which is like an extreme right-wing party, or with the movement Stačilo, Enough, which is centered around communists, then of course this pressure for major changes would be much, much bigger. Although Andrej Babiš says that under his watch, Czechia will never ever, for example, call for referendum on the EU or NATO withdrawal. So the question really will be who will join Andrej Babiš as potential coalition partner, and then we will have a clear view whether the turn or whether the change will be just a minor one or whether it's going to be a major one.
And it's really intriguing because by making these statements, he clearly had something in mind. What do you think that was? Was he trying to simply draw the line for potential coalition partners, saying, okay, we might actually be on the same page on certain policies, for example, regarding the European Union, the Green Deal, stuff like that, but we're not going to quit the EU, we're not going to quit NATO, so the adjustments could be minor, but not very radical? Or is he perhaps trying to send a signal to other parties than the most radical ones, saying, look, if you want to join my government, you're welcome to do so, because I'm not quite as radical as the media perhaps is trying to portray me as?
There is something from everyone you've just said, and that's the result of the fact that ANO, the movement that Andrej Babiš is heading, is a very broad movement. They gain the support and attention from people from all over the political spectrum. This is why Andrej Babiš basically never in his political career had any long-time, consistent, permanent ideological affiliation or ideological and programmatic definition. He has been very pragmatic. So in the same time, he's able to make some EU critical comments, but at the same time making a pro-European statement. So the messages that he was sending in the past days partially were some kind of defense. He was defending himself because most of the coalition parties, they ran the campaign on accusing Babiš of turning Czechia's foreign policy more eastwards. So he was trying to defend himself, which is very rare situation because Andrej Babiš, when it comes to election campaigns, he's more offensive. He's not the one who would need to defend himself. But this was one of the very rare moments where he took some defensive position and said that it's unfair to judge him as the pro-Russian politician, as the politician who would like to drag Czechia out of EU or NATO. So this is why, in my opinion, he made these very loud statements, because among his voters there are also people who are committed to Europe, to Western Europe, to NATO and EU, but at the same time he needs to maintain the voter base which is more critical towards European Union, and also he needs to maintain connection with potential coalition partners. So he's always balancing on these issues, and one day being pro-European, the other day being very Europe critical. I think that his overall position will be similar to Robert Fico or Viktor Orbán's, that he will be critical to European Union. You already mentioned the Green Deal. He's also critical to Migration Pact, but at the same time he will have no intention to leave the EU because it's not in his political interest, and it's also not in his personal interest, given how much money his firms are actually receiving from European subsidies.
So here's a political chameleon who's benefiting from the close ties with the West. And that's something that was actually pointed out in several articles, that he cannot simply afford to switch to Russia or China because he has a lot to lose by doing this. But coming back to the policies that could change, briefly, what about Ukraine? He has also been campaigning on suspending the Czech ammunition initiative. But again, can he afford to completely abandon this? Because, well, the Czech Republic has a strong arms industry. Do you think that this might actually factor in so that the policy towards Ukraine will be softened, modified, but will not be a complete turnaround?
Yes, I believe that if Andrej Babiš is appointed the prime minister, he will not totally abandon the support for Ukraine. Also, in this issue, he has made several flip-flops. At the beginning of the Russian invasion to Ukraine in February 2022, he was very strongly pro-Ukrainian. He was praising Zelensky as being a hero. Of course, as the war was getting longer and longer, and a certain exhaustion came also in the field of support of the people of the Czech society towards Ukraine, he also started to be a little bit less supportive. However, he argues that whenever there was some resolution being passed in the Czech parliament which supported Ukraine, his MPs, they were always voting for such resolution. So again, making these statements that both show the strong support for Ukraine, but at the same time trying to soften the support a little bit. This abandonment or potential abandonment of the ammunition initiative, which Andrej Babiš said that he would do, is in his eyes something that he would like to shift more to NATO. So he's not rejecting it per se, but he's saying that it should be the NATO's coordination, or under NATO's coordination, not under the coordination of Czechia. But again, we are in the situation that as a NATO country, we should somehow take part in a lot of policies which are framed by NATO. So there is we can still see a certain division between Czechia and NATO, Czechia and EU, that sometimes he says it shouldn't be done by Czechia, it should be done by NATO, or it should be done by EU, which he basically shows that he considers Czechia and NATO or Czechia and EU as two entities, which of course is not appropriate because we are part of the NATO. But we'll see. The pre-election pre-election statements are usually a special, or pre-election campaign is usually a special time for making statements that not always are then followed after the elections, because in campaign you primarily address your voters because you need the votes, but usually after the elections the rhetoric sometimes changes. So we'll and especially given the fact how often Andrej Babiš changes the rhetorics, I think we should wait for what he actually does if he becomes the prime minister.
So, who are the Russians betting on? Because there are reports of unprecedented interference using TikTok accounts which have gathered more exposure than the accounts of leading politicians, leading mainstream politicians. So, is Russia basically trying to sow chaos by supporting fringe parties on both sides of the spectrum?
Exactly. It's not the ANO which would be the main target for support. I mean, target by Russians, although there's been some news that Russia is kind of hoping or giving their hopes in ANO, in the rule or the Czechia being ruled by ANO. But in my opinion, it's more meant in the way that ANO will very likely connected with some other parties after the elections in coalition, and these are the parties that are mainly benefiting from the Russian interference, both on the extreme right as well as extreme left. If we can still use this left-right scale, it's now rather a division a little bit different. These let's say illiberal forces versus the liberal democratic forces. So both the SPD, the Freedom and Direct Democracy, as well as the communist-built alliance, Stačilo enough, they are the ones who also in the public space mostly spread the Russian narratives. So those are also the ones who would mainly benefit from the Russian interference. Whenever we see any news that are or the news that are spread on these disinformation media or TikTok fake accounts, they are usually using the same argumentation as these two parties' argumentations are in a public space.
But what would be the role of President Petr Pavel? He indicated earlier on that he's not going to allow any radical shift, anything that would harm the democratic system of the Czech Republic. Does he have the political toolkit to influence the government formation, for example, by proposing to the potential winner, look, I will actually allow you to form a government, but not with the most radical parties on the political scene. So take your pick. If you don't do that, perhaps somebody else will receive the proposal to form the government.
This will be first major challenge for Petr Pavel while being in the office, although he's being in the office for more than 2.5 years already, so he's in the second half of his term. He has never faced such challenging situation, because on one side you don't want, and that's what President even said by his own words, you don't want to go against the will of the people, because the people will speak during the election, so there will be some outcomes, and it's very likely that also the radical political parties will get a substantial representation in parliament. On the other hand, there are some let's say frame basic conditions of the post 1989 development, which of course should not be questioned, including this Euro-Atlantic integration processes and the inclusion of Czechia in NATO and EU. What President specifically said that he would have a huge problem in appointing someone who would question the Czech membership in EU and Czech membership in NATO. He had a meeting with Andrej Babiš in past days, although the meeting was mainly about how Babiš is going to solve his conflict of interest should he be appointed the prime minister. They also briefly touched the issue of the Czech foreign policy under potential Babiš government. And the president just yesterday, when he was casting the vote at his home, he answered the question of one of the foreign journalists about this, and he said that they feel, Petr Pavel and Andrej Babiš, they feel the same about the EU and NATO. So it seems that the prime or potential prime minister Andrej Babiš would be on the same level of this EU and NATO support also for his government and the potential coalition partners.
And I have to park our conversation here, unfortunately. It's still fascinating political dynamics dynamics
Okay.
at play there. We're waiting for the results from the election. Petr Just was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you and goodbye.
And I'm Andrej Babiš. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us.